Welcome to our deep dive on a relationship dynamic that, on the surface, seems utterly normal: smiles at gatherings, cozy weekends, late night talks. But as Professor Vaknin suggests, beneath this veneer lies something parasitic, something that consumes the very core of a person. Could you explain why narcissistic abuse is often so invisible, even to the people experiencing it?
Absolutely. Narcissistic abuse operates covertly because it mimics healthy behaviors. The abuser mirrors your values, fears, and dreams, creating a convincing illusion of connection. This performance is so sophisticated that victims internalize the narrative, believing they're in a loving partnership when, in reality, they're slowly being psychologically colonized.
That idea of psychological colonization is chilling. How does this mask of affection make it so difficult for people and outsiders to recognize the abuse?
The abuser weaponizes empathy and social scripts, so onlookers see only the smiles and thoughtful gestures. Victims often doubt their own perceptions, which prevents them from seeking help. It's not about shouting or violence, it's about subtle, persistent erosion of identity, making the abuse nearly invisible until deep damage is done.
Let's transition to one of the most insidious tools in narcissistic relationships: gaslighting. You describe situations where facts are twisted and memories are denied. In what ways does gaslighting systematically erode a person's sense of self?
Gaslighting is a deliberate campaign to destabilize your trust in your memory and logic. It starts subtly denying conversations, insisting events didn't happen, and escalates until the victim questions their very sanity. This isn't accidental misunderstanding, it's a calculated identity theft designed to make the victim dependent on the abuser for reality checks.
Many people might dismiss this as simple miscommunication, but neuroscience suggests otherwise, right?
Exactly. Chronic gaslighting activates the amygdala, increasing fear and anxiety, while weakening the hippocampus, which governs memory. Over time, the prefrontal cortex responsible for judgment becomes compromised. The result isn't just emotional confusion, but literal neurological sabotage.
Building on that, you mentioned how abusers blend praise with contradiction, a compliment followed by denial. How does this praise-confusion cycle function as a manipulation tool?
This cycle is incredibly destabilizing. The abuser intersperses positive reinforcement with subtle undermining, making the victim crave validation while doubting their instincts. It's like being kept off balance on purpose. Every compliment is immediately tainted by contradiction, so the victim becomes addicted to seeking approval, unsure which version of reality to trust.
So the confusion isn't accidental, it's the goal?
Precisely. The victim's growing uncertainty is engineered to increase control. The more they question themselves, the more they rely on the abuser for cues on how to think and feel. It's a form of mental busywork that keeps the victim too preoccupied to challenge the relationship's dynamics.
If we look deeper, you describe victims feeling addicted rather than connected. Can you unpack the neurological and psychological mechanisms behind this sense of addiction?
Certainly, narcissistic relationships exploit intermittent reinforcement reward system where affection is given unpredictably, much like a slot machine. This unpredictability floods the brain with dopamine, making the victim crave the abuser's attention while never feeling secure. It's the same neurochemical process seen in substance addiction.
That's fascinating and disturbing. How does this cycle keep victims trapped, even when they recognize the toxicity?
Withdrawal is emotionally painful. The sporadic rewards create hope for change, so victims stay, convinced the next hit of affection will be different. They become emotionally dependent, mistaking relief from anxiety as evidence of love, when it's actually the chemical aftermath of manipulation.
You've touched on the Pygmalion effect, the idea that victims project their hopes onto the abuser. How does this psychological phenomenon deepen the trap?
Victims often believe their love will inspire change, essentially creating a fantasy version of the abuser. This projection overrides red flags and perpetuates self-blame. It's a cognitive bias where the victim invests in what could be rather than what is, making it increasingly difficult to leave, even after years of disappointment.
Could you share a real-world example of this effect in action?
Certainly. One woman described a 12-year relationship where affection was sparse, Yet she remained hopeful, convinced her loyalty would eventually elicit empathy. She later realized she wasn't loved, she was kept in a state of emotional withdrawal, punctuated by crumbs of affection.
Let's move to another signature dynamic. The victim always apologizing even when hurt. Why do survivors find themselves repeatedly taking the blame in these relationships?
This is the result of moral manipulation. Narcissists redirect blame so skillfully that the victim's empathy becomes weaponized against them. To maintain peace and avoid further conflict, victims apologize not because they're at fault, but because it's a learned survival strategy. Over time, this self-blame becomes internalized.
So, it's not about emotional imbalance, but a deliberate tactic?
Exactly. The abuser maintains composure, framing the victim as unstable. This strategic calmness increases the victim's sense of guilt, making them question their own emotional reactions and ultimately silencing their authentic voice.
That leads us to the transformation of stoicism into self-punishment. How does the need to keep the peace morph into self-erasure over time?
Victims learn that suppressing their pain and assuming blame is the fastest route to ending tension. This people-pleasing becomes a default, but it comes at a high cost. They lose their sense of self and clarity regarding what constitutes healthy conflict. The desire for harmony overrides the need for honesty.
Is this why many survivors struggle to identify abusive patterns in future relationships?
Absolutely. Their internal compass has been recalibrated to prioritize the other person's comfort over their own truth. This makes it difficult to recognize or assert boundaries, perpetuating a cycle of unhealthy dynamics.
You've mentioned that within the cycle, victims often feel emotionally numb and even defend their abuser. How does this numbing serve as a coping mechanism?
Emotional numbness is a form of psychological self-preservation. When abuse becomes routine, the nervous system shuts down non-essential responses like alarm or anger to minimize pain. Paradoxically, defending the abuser feels safer than confronting abandonment because the victim's survival instincts have been reprogrammed to tolerate mistreatment.
So, in that state, being used actually feels less threatening than being alone?
Precisely. The brain equates abandonment with existential danger, so clinging to the relationship even at great personal cost seems like the lesser evil. This is why victims often rationalize or justify the abuser's behavior, even to themselves.
Next, let's address love bombing the overwhelming displays of affection early in the relationship. How is this different from genuine intimacy?
Love bombing isn't about connection, it's about conquest. The abuser floods the victim with attention, compliments, and grand gestures, creating an emotional high that feels irresistible. But this intensity is strategic, designed to disarm defenses and fast-track emotional dependency. Once the victim is hooked, the affection becomes conditional.
Is there a biological reason love bombing is so effective?
Yes. The brain interprets intense, unpredictable attention as evidence of deep attachment, releasing oxytocin and dopamine. This chemical surge impairs critical judgment, making it nearly impossible for the victim to recognize red flags until they're deeply entangled.
As we approach the end, let's focus on recovery. If traditional relationship advice fails in these cases, what steps can survivors take to break free and reclaim their clarity?
The first step is recognizing that this isn't about compatibility, but about psychological manipulation. Survivors need specialized support ideally from trauma-informed therapists to rebuild self-trust and re-establish boundaries. Practices like journaling, mindfulness, and group therapy help restore emotional clarity and separate the abuser's narrative from their own identity.
Are there early warning signs people can look for to protect themselves in the future?
Absolutely. Watch for patterns of gaslighting, chronic blame shifting, and love bombing. If you find yourself doubting your reality or apologizing for your emotions, that's a red flag. Healthy relationships foster security and authenticity, not confusion or fear.
To wrap up, you've described these relationships as performances rather than genuine connections. What final message would you offer to someone questioning whether they're truly loved or just playing a part?
Remember, love is not a script you're handed, it's a space where your authentic self is seen and valued. If you're constantly adapting, doubting, or apologizing for your existence, it's time to ask, is this love or just a role you've been assigned? Reclaiming your voice is the first act of freedom.